The Haunted Road. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The night was dark, the wind howling through the trees, as a group of friends set off down a forgotten stretch of road that had long been rumored to be haunted. The dense forest around them was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They had heard the stories, the ones about the spirits of the past, restless souls, and unexplainable noises that echoed through the night. But they didn't believe in such things, not really. They were just stories, after all, told to scare children. Or so they thought. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the temperature seemed to drop. The headlights of the car flickered, casting long, unnerving shadows along the path ahead. The trees loomed over them, like ancient sentinels watching their every move. The road stretched on and on, winding through the woods, a lonely ribbon of asphalt in the middle of nowhere. One of them, the most skeptical of the group, joked that they were just going to get lost, but no one laughed. It felt as if the very air around them had thickened. Suddenly, the car hit something, a loud thud echoing in the night. They all looked out the windows, but there was nothing on the road. A sense of unease settled in, as if something unseen had just brushed past them. The skeptical friend tried to reassure the group, insisting it was just a bump, but even he seemed rattled. They drove on, but the unease only grew stronger. Every corner seemed to reveal more shadows, and every tree seemed to hold someone watching. Without warning, the car came to a screeching halt. The engine sputtered, and the headlights went out. They were plunged into darkness. The sound of their breathing was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence. They tried to start the car again, but it was no use. It was as if the road itself had swallowed their vehicle. Panic set in, and they fumbled for their phones, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. In the distance, they saw something, a faint light, moving slowly toward them. It flickered like a lantern, casting a pale, ghostly glow. A sense of dread washed over them as the light drew nearer. They didn't know what it was, but they knew they should not stay to find out. Without a word, they bolted from the car, scrambling through the underbrush in a desperate bid to escape whatever was approaching. As they ran, the light seemed to follow them, flickering in and out of sight. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed behind them. It wasn't their own, something else was out there, moving in the dark, something that shouldn't be. They could hear whispers now, faint voices calling their names from the shadows, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. They had to get away. They had to make it out. Finally, they broke through the trees and onto a road that seemed vaguely familiar. They didn't look back. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if something was right on their heels. Their hearts pounded in their chests, their legs burning from the effort, but they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. As they reached the edge of the road, a vehicle appeared from the darkness, headlights blinding them. Without thinking, they rushed toward it, waving their arms, desperate for help. The car slowed, the door creaking open. But when they reached the window, they froze. The driver was a pale, hollow-eyed man, his face twisted in a grimace. His lips didn't move, but they could hear him clearly in their minds, "You shouldn't have come here." In an instant, the door slammed shut, and the car sped off into the night, leaving them standing on the road, breathless and terrified. The road was silent once more, but now they knew the stories were true. The road was haunted, and they were never meant to leave. They turned around and began to walk back, not knowing where they were going, only knowing they couldn't stay. But as they moved through the darkness, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, just out of sight. The horrors of the haunted road were far from over. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, the headlights of their car now flickering faintly, as if resisting the very urge to illuminate the path before them. The friends had been driving for what felt like hours, but the landscape around them seemed unchanged, trees towering on either side, their branches knotted like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. No houses, no other cars. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that whistled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. "Are we sure we should be here?" one of them asked, her voice tinged with doubt. It was Clara, the one who had always been the skeptic, but even she couldn't hide the nervous edge that crept into her tone. "Relax, Clara. It's just a road," said Ethan, trying to sound confident but not entirely convincing. "Nothing's going to happen. Just a bunch of spooky stories passed down over the years." But even as he said it, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The stories had always intrigued him, even if he didn't fully believe them. Whispers of travelers who vanished without a trace, of eerie lights flickering in the distance, of figures in the woods that no one could quite explain. Still, he brushed it off, just a coincidence, nothing more. The others laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. But that laughter died in their throats as the car hit another bump, this time more severe than the last. The tires screeched against something hard on the road, the sound of scraping metal filling the air. They all braced themselves, the world outside their windows momentarily spinning. "Did we hit something, Maya?" another friend asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, let's just keep going," replied Ethan, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. But when he tried to accelerate, the car seemed to hesitate, as though it were reluctant to continue. With a soft growl of the engine, it finally lurched forward again, but something felt wrong. The air grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones, and the road began to narrow, the trees crowding in from both sides, blocking the view ahead. Clara shuddered, looking out her window. She thought she saw something, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be human, too unnatural to be an animal. She turned to the others, her face pale. "Did you see that?" "I didn't see anything," Maya responded, though her voice wavered. She had seen something, too. Something in the corner of her eye, but when she looked directly at it, the shadow had vanished. The road twisted ahead, curving sharply, and with each turn, the feeling of unease grew. The headlights flickered again, their pale glow casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for them like hands, as though the trees themselves were alive and trying to pull them in. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white, but he refused to slow down. The engine sputtered once more, and then nothing. Complete silence. The car lurched to a stop, and the engine died. "Not again," Ethan muttered, slamming his hand on the dashboard in frustration. He turned the key, trying to start the engine, but it refused to turn over. "Maybe we should get out and check it," Maya suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "No way," Ethan replied quickly. "We'll be fine. We're not far from the main road." But even as he said it, he knew deep down that they were lost. There was no main road. The trees around them were too thick, the sky too dark. The silence was deafening. And then came the light. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, barely visible through the trees. But as they sat there, waiting for the car to restart, the light grew brighter and moved closer, swaying like a lantern held by someone walking along the road. It was an eerie, cold light, glowing faintly with an unnatural hue. "Who's out there?" Ethan called, his voice shaky despite his attempt to sound calm. No answer came. But the light continued moving toward them, slowly, deliberately. It seemed to float, hovering just above the ground, casting an eerie, pale glow on the trees around them. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. None of them knew what to say. "I don't like this," Clara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. There was no escape. The car was dead, and the light, now closer, cast long shadows that crept along the sides of the vehicle. They could feel its presence whatever it was drawing closer. Suddenly, the door slammed open. The force of it almost made Ethan jump out of his seat. Clara was the first to bolt from the car, her legs shaky but propelled by instinct, by fear. The others followed her, scrambling into the dense woods. The sound of their footsteps, their frantic breathing, was drowned out by the rustling of unseen things moving in the dark around them. The light, now much closer, seemed to follow them. It didn't speed up, but it moved in an unnatural rhythm, keeping pace as if it had a purpose. They could hear whispers now, faint voices drifting on the wind. The whispers grew louder, words that they couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable, demanding, warning, and eerily familiar, as if they were being called by someone they had once known. And then, they heard something worse: footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Something was following them. Clara stumbled first, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. She scrambled to get up, but as she did, she glanced over her shoulder, and her face turned ashen. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure, a tall, thin silhouette with glowing eyes, its features impossible to make out in the dim light. It was watching them, motionless, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Run!" Maya screamed, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her up. The others were already ahead, but Clara's legs were trembling, her breath coming in short gasps. They had to move, but it felt like their feet were cemented to the ground, as if the very earth beneath them was trying to hold them in place. The figure in the trees moved closer, its outline becoming clearer, though no more comforting. A gaunt face with hollow eyes, and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, as though it were waiting for something. The sound of its breathing, slow and deep, could be heard in the distance, almost rhythmic, as though it were savoring the moment before the chase began. With renewed fear, they ran, the sound of their panicked footsteps the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. They didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to question where they were going. They just had to escape. But then, there it was, the road. The same road, somehow. They had circled back to where they started, the same stretch of haunted road they had entered only moments before. It was then that they saw it, a vehicle, headlights blinding them as it came to a slow stop in front of them. Without thinking, they rushed toward it, waving their arms desperately, pleading for help. But when the driver's door creaked open, their blood ran cold. The man who emerged was pale, his skin almost translucent, his eyes black and lifeless. His mouth stretched into a twisted grin, but his lips didn't move. Instead, they heard him in their minds, his voice cold and commanding, "You shouldn't have come here." Before any of them could react, the door slammed shut, the car sped off, leaving them standing in the middle of the road, breathless and terrified. As they turned back to the woods, they realized the truth: the road wasn't just haunted by the memories of the past. It was alive, and it had claimed them. There would be no escape. As the darkness closed in around them, the whispers returned, and the figures from the trees began to step into the road, following them with eyes that burned into their very souls. The road ahead seemed endless, like a snake twisting through the dense woods, its dark silhouette barely visible under the canopy of branches that reached down like fingers, threatening to touch the travelers as they moved forward. They could barely see the markings on the road, the faded lines nearly consumed by the forest, but they pressed on, despite the growing unease. Their nerves were taut, and each of them felt the suffocating grip of something far older than the trees surrounding them, something older than any legend or story. The headlights of the car flickered and dimmed once more, casting their surroundings in fleeting shadows, but the night was far too thick to penetrate. As the car slowed, the sound of the tires against the gravel echoed far louder than normal, like a heartbeat growing louder and louder in the vast emptiness. The rustling wind carried strange, whispered voices, words that no one could understand, but they were unmistakable, the sound of something speaking in a language that had no place in the world of the living. "Is this place cursed?" Maya asked, her voice a tremor of doubt. "I told you this road wasn't safe," Clara said under her breath, her face drawn tight in fear, her hand gripping the armrest as though it could somehow offer protection. "I can feel something here, something watching us." The tension in the car was palpable. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened as he tried once again to start the engine, but this time there was no sputter, no flicker of life from the car. It was as though the vehicle itself had surrendered to the dark. His hand flew to the dashboard in frustration, slamming the surface. "We're stuck," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The truth settled in like a weight on his chest. "We need to get out, Ethan. We need to leave right now," Clara urged, her voice desperate. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He didn't need to be told. There was something wrong here, something that couldn't be explained away. Without another word, he swung open the door and stepped outside. His boots hit the gravel, and the sharp, cool air bit at his skin, making him feel more alive than he had in the last few hours. But it also made his heart pound harder, faster. Something in the air felt wrong. He motioned for the others to follow, and one by one, they stepped out of the car. The cold immediately pressed against them, and the eerie silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. The darkness was suffocating, stretching out beyond what their eyes could perceive, and the light from their car, once a beacon, now felt feeble, swallowed by the forest that surrounded them. Clara pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. She could have sworn she saw something move between the trees, a shape, shifting and dark, just on the edge of her vision. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her breath quickening. The others went silent, straining to listen. At first, it was nothing but the wind, carrying the occasional rustling of leaves, but then, as if the trees themselves were alive and whispering secrets, the noise became distinct, a low groan that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a long, drawn-out sound, like the groan of some ancient, suffering thing. A moment later, the groan turned to a low, breathy chuckle. It wasn't the wind. "I don't like this," Ethan muttered, his voice shaking now. He turned back to the car, but something made him hesitate. Something unseen, something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel it, a presence, cold and malevolent, creeping in from all directions. The others, noticing his hesitation, looked at him with growing concern. They didn't want to admit it either, but they could all feel the shift in the air, the strange pressure that had settled around them, thick and suffocating. And then came the light again. It wasn't just a flicker in the distance this time. It was closer, moving toward them with an unnatural slowness, as though it had all the time in the world to make its way toward them. The light was pale, ghostly, its glow flickering in and out, barely illuminating the road ahead. It seemed almost alive, its movements deliberate and haunting. As it neared, the trees seemed to bend toward it, their branches creaking as if they were reacting to its presence. The light paused for a brief moment, as though it had become aware of their gaze, before it began to move again, closer, closer. "Run!" Maya screamed. Before anyone could respond, Clara was already sprinting down the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The others followed, their feet pounding against the gravel as they tore down the path, their only thought to escape the light that seemed to draw them in. The woods around them were no longer silent. The air was filled with the faint whispers again, words that held no meaning but sent a cold, shuddering sensation through their spines. They could feel eyes on them, something unseen was watching, moving with them, the very trees themselves seeming to shift as though they were closing in. Maya stumbled, falling to the ground with a loud cry. Clara turned and grabbed her hand, pulling her up. She could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was mirrored in her own. Behind them, the light grew brighter, and the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone or something walking toward them, its presence almost tangible, echoed through the trees. "Keep going!" Ethan yelled, looking back for only a moment, but that moment was enough. The light, closer than ever, was joined by something else, shadows moving, figures stepping into the clearing. Tall, twisted forms that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself, their long, gaunt limbs reaching for them. And then came the whisper that froze them all. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was deep, distorted, and it echoed not in their ears but in their minds, shaking them to their core. They didn't dare look back. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in around them like a trap. The road, once their escape, now seemed like a labyrinth with no exit. They had no choice but to keep running, to follow the faint outline of the road ahead. But the further they ran, the more the landscape seemed to shift. What had been a road moments before now twisted in impossible ways. The trees grew thicker, more entangled, and it felt like the woods themselves were alive, changing the world around them with every step they took. The figures in the darkness seemed to move with them, following their every move, their every breath. The wind howled louder, and the ground beneath their feet trembled, as though something massive was shifting deep below. Their feet moved faster now, desperation fueling their steps, but no matter how quickly they ran, the end of the road never seemed to get closer. The figures moved closer, now almost within arm's reach. The whispering voices grew louder, until they were all around them, speaking in a language they couldn't understand but somehow knew was warning them. The trees parted, revealing something terrible, a giant figure, impossibly tall, draped in shadows. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed with a faint, unholy light, and its presence pressed down on them with the weight of centuries. It reached out a hand, long fingers stretching like tendrils, and a voice, dark and ancient, echoed through the woods. "Your journey ends here." With one final, frantic scream, the group turned and ran as fast as their legs would carry them, but it was already too late. The shadows engulfed them. The world around them seemed to collapse, the very earth beneath their feet shaking violently as the air became thick with an oppressive force. The trees, once towering and protective, now seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting into monstrous shapes. The road, which had once seemed like their only hope of escape, had become a twisted labyrinth, stretching endlessly into a dark abyss. There was no direction anymore, just the endless, suffocating night and the terrible realization that they were not alone. Clara's breath was ragged as she struggled to keep her pace, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear the terrifying sounds closing in behind her. Her legs burned, but the fear driving her was stronger. She glanced over her shoulder for a split second, and her stomach dropped. The figure in the shadows had moved closer, its massive form seemingly stretching impossibly tall. Its glowing eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and as it stepped forward, the ground seemed to quiver beneath its weight. Every step it took resonated through the trees, sending a ripple of unease through the very air around them. No, 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 no. Maya's voice cracked as she gasped for air, her legs trembling beneath her. She reached for Clara's hand, pulling herself forward as if the very act of moving would keep them alive. But with every step they took, the figures in the dark seemed to get closer, the whispers in the wind growing more frantic, their voices almost tangible. Suddenly, a guttural sound broke through the silence like a low growl, deep and predatory. It wasn't from any animal they knew. The sound came from the depths of the forest itself, as though the trees had voices, and those voices were calling to them. Ethan's face twisted in fear as he looked ahead. The dark shadows ahead seemed to split apart, revealing more figures, tall, skeletal shapes, wrapped in shadows that moved like liquid. Their faces were blank, empty, and their eyes were deep voids, as though the very light of the world had been sucked from them. Their presence drained the warmth from the air, leaving only a chill that gnawed at the skin. "We're not going to make it," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible, but the panic in her eyes said more than words ever could. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to push forward, his legs trembling under the weight of his fear. But no matter how fast they ran, the shadows stretched further, pulling them closer with every passing moment. The ground beneath them seemed to rise and fall, the path becoming more uneven as though the very road was bending to the will of the darkness. And then came the whispers, louder this time, more distinct. They filled their heads, overwhelming them with messages they couldn't fully understand. Words tangled in their minds, like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, echoing in their souls. They were not just hearing these words, they were feeling them, as if they were part of the fabric of their being. "You will never leave." The words were clear now. They didn't speak, but were pressed into their minds with an intensity that burned. Clara's chest tightened as the weight of the words sank in. She could feel her breath catching in her throat as a cold sensation crept up her spine, ice creeping through her veins. There was no escape. The road was alive, and it had been waiting for them, for any who dared to venture down its path. As the ground beneath them quaked, the shadows seemed to converge, surrounding them from all sides. There was no place to turn, no safe haven to hide. The air had thickened into a heavy fog, and in the distance, the faint flickering of the ghostly light could still be seen, its glow growing stronger as if drawn to them by some unseen force. The trees had closed in completely now, their twisted branches blocking any escape, leaving them with only the darkness and the figures closing in around them. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The shadows stretched toward her, their long, gnarled fingers reaching out, brushing against her skin with coldness that made her entire body tremble. She felt something strange, then something deep within her gut, like the ground itself was alive. The very earth beneath them was moving, groaning with ancient agony. She couldn't explain it, but she knew without a doubt that the road, the woods, the darkness around them, it was all one entity, one living, breathing force that was drawing them into its depths. The figure in the shadows, the one who had towered over them all this time, stepped forward. Its glowing eyes burned even brighter, and its mouth split open, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. It was no longer a creature from the dark, it was something far worse. It was a presence, something ancient and all-consuming. "You shouldn't have come," the voice rumbled, but it wasn't from the figure's mouth. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in their minds, rattling their thoughts. Clara's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her vision swimming. She could hear Maya's frantic gasps, feel the grip of her hand, but her mind was slipping. There was no escape. There was no hope. And yet, they still ran. But the shadows were relentless. They clung to them, curling around their legs like tendrils, pulling them down into the earth itself. Clara's heart beat wildly, and the ground trembled once more as the figures closed in around them. The whispers intensified, becoming more than words. They were visions, flashes of terrible, ancient images that played out before their eyes like a twisted film reel. They saw glimpses of past travelers who had vanished along this road, people who had come before them, lost in the same eternal cycle of darkness. Their faces were twisted in horror, their eyes wide with the terror of realization as they were pulled into the void. The shadows that had once surrounded them now took form, ghostly figures, once human, now stripped of their humanity, bound forever to the cursed road. In a final act of desperation, Ethan grabbed Clara's arm and yanked her toward what he thought was a clearing in the distance. But as they reached it, they found themselves standing before a massive stone archway, an ancient ruin hidden deep within the forest. The archway was covered in moss and twisted roots, and something about it felt familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting. The archway loomed like a mouth, dark and cavernous, and as they approached, the air grew even colder. The figures behind them stopped, their hollow eyes focused on the archway, as though drawn to it. The whispers quieted, but the dread remained, thickening in the air like a fog. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What is this?" "This is the end," Ethan whispered. He could feel the weight of it now, the finality of the place. There was no escaping. They had walked straight into the heart of the curse, to the very point where the road began, where it would never let them leave. The ground beneath their feet began to crack and shift as the archway pulsed, like a living, breathing thing. The figures that had been following them now moved toward it, their skeletal hands reaching for the arch, merging with the shadows that emanated from it. And then, a terrible, overwhelming force pressed against them, like the weight of the entire world. Their vision blurred as the shadows enveloped them, swallowing them whole, pulling them down into the darkness that had claimed so many before. Clara's final thought, as the darkness consumed her, was a single, desperate cry. "No, not us, please." But it was too late. The road had claimed them. And in the distance, the whispering voices began again, louder, darker, and more insistent than ever before. "You will never leave." The sensation of being swallowed by the dark was unlike anything they had experienced. It wasn't simply that the light had vanished, it was as if the very fabric of reality itself was stretching and folding, pulling them into a place where time and space no longer existed. They could no longer feel the ground beneath their feet. They were suspended in a strange, formless void, an endless black that was thick with a presence that smothered them. It pressed in on their chests, making it hard to breathe. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and smelled of decay, like the forgotten corners of the world. But amid the suffocating black, they could still feel each other. Maya's hand gripped Clara's arm tightly, a lifeline in the abyss. Ethan's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he fought to keep his mind from unraveling. They were there together, but they could feel something, something watching them from beyond the veil of darkness. Something ancient. Something terrible. And then, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint voices on the wind. They were clear, sharp, and insistent. They weren't coming from one place or person, they came from everywhere, from inside their own minds, from every corner of the black void that surrounded them. You should have never walked the road. You should have never come. The words weren't spoken, they were felt. They sank deep into their minds, wrapping around their thoughts like chains, each syllable a heavy weight, dragging them down further into the endless void. Clara tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. She couldn't even move. She could feel Maya's hand in hers, but it seemed distant now, like they were no longer in the same place at all. The void seemed to stretch, swallowing any sense of reality. Their surroundings blurred, trees, shadows, even the figures that had been chasing them, all of it began to melt away. All that remained was the cold and the whispers. And then, the air shifted. It wasn't just a breeze or a gust, it was a presence, moving in the darkness. It was an ancient force, so old it could not be named. It began to take shape. At first, it was only a flicker, an outline, but then the darkness in front of them began to warp, and a massive figure began to materialize from the shadows. The air crackled with its power. The figure was enormous, towering over them with a sense of grandeur that made the surrounding blackness seem even more suffocating. It was neither man nor beast, but something in between, something too large to be comprehended by human senses. Its body was shrouded in tattered, flowing robes made of shadow, the fabric rippling like smoke in a windless storm. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its glowing eyes, pale and unblinking, burned like twin lanterns, casting a sickly light on the vast expanse of darkness. It spoke, but not with words. The voice that reached their minds was deeper than the earth itself. It reverberated through their souls, shaking them to the core. It was an unholy sound that made them feel insignificant, like they were nothing more than insects before a predator. "You are lost now, travelers." The voice reverberated in Clara's mind like an earthquake, the words tearing at the fabric of her sanity. She stumbled back, but there was no place to retreat. No safe ground, no escape. They were trapped in this endless space with this thing, this ancient force that had witnessed the beginning and the end of all things. "This road is mine, and all who walk it belong to me." The entity's voice echoed again, swirling around them. It was so powerful that it felt like it was inside their very bones. Ethan's knees gave way, and he fell to the ground, unable to hold himself upright under the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. He could feel the coldness in the air, seeping into his bones, his skin, his very soul. It was a hunger, an emptiness that gnawed at him from the inside, and he couldn't escape it. The shadows around him seemed to pulsate, alive and aware, closing in tighter with each passing second. Maya gasped for breath, her chest tight with terror. Her hand clutched Clara's arm harder, but even that seemed to fade, as if they were slipping farther away from each other. She couldn't see her anymore. The world was turning into a spinning vortex, a whirlpool of despair that pulled at her from all sides. We have to get out," Maya whispered, though she knew even as she said it, that it was pointless. There was no escape. Not anymore. The figure before them loomed larger, its body made of darkness, tendrils of shadow curling and twisting like living serpents, reaching out toward them. As it moved, the space around them seemed to bend and stretch, as though they were being pulled through an endless tunnel. Time and space no longer had meaning. It was all just a web, a twisted, infinite web, and they were caught in its snare. The figure's hands reached forward, but it didn't need to touch them. It simply extended a single, skeletal hand, and the darkness obeyed, wrapping around them, curling in on them like a suffocating fog. Clara, Maya, and Ethan could feel it now, not just the presence of the creature, but its overwhelming hunger. It was a primal thing, a force of nature so ancient that it predated the very concept of time. It wanted them. It needed them. And it would have them. They couldn't move. They couldn't speak. The weight of the darkness around them pressed harder, and their vision blurred. All they could hear now were the whispers growing louder, more frantic, drowning out their thoughts, their voices. And then, in the final, terrible moment of clarity, they saw it. The road. It was not a road at all. It was a prison, a construct that bound them, bound all those who had come before them. The trees were not just trees. They were guardians, sentinels of this place. And the entity, the one before them, was not just a being. It was the gatekeeper of a world beyond the living, a world that had no mercy, no escape. The shadows wrapped around them, pulling them toward the figure. Clara's chest tightened, her heart beat a deafening drum. Maya's scream was swallowed by the dark, fading into nothing. Ethan's last breath caught in his throat. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the shadows collapsed into nothingness, leaving only the silence of the void. The road was still there, but they were no longer on it. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, the entity's voice whispered again, its cold laughter echoing through the void. Another soul to wander the road, forever. The end.